The axe blade bit deep into the oak, sending splinters flying as Cormac Holloway's weathered hands gripped the handle with brutal force. Each swing carried the weight of his rage at the banker who'd posted notices all over Willow Creek, advertising widows for hire like cattle at auction. Pregnant widow seeks employment. Excellent cook. Willing to relocate for honest work. The notice had been crumpled in his fist for 3 days now, the ink smeared by his calloused thumb. He'd paid the banker's fee more money than he'd spent in 2 years because winter was coming to the Colorado mountains, and even a man who preferred solitude to society needed hot meals when the snow piled 12 feet deep. But when the wagon finally creaked up his mountain trail that October morning, what climbed down wasn't the worn-out, desperate creature he'd expected. Isadora Whitmore moved with quiet dignity despite her swollen belly, her copper hair catching sunlight like burnished metal. She surveyed his rough-hewn cabin and the valley stretching below with intelligent amber eyes that held no judgment, only assessment. "Mr. Holloway, I presume?" Her voice carried traces of education, refinement that had no business in these wild places. Cormac buried his axe in the chopping block and straightened, suddenly aware of his unkempt beard and patched clothing. "You're supposed to be." He gestured vaguely at her condition. "Pregnant?" Isadora's smile held steel beneath silk. "I am that, sir. 6 months along, if it matters to our arrangement." Arrangement was for cooking and cleaning, nothing else. The words came out harsher than intended, but Cormac had learned that harsh words kept people at a distance where they belonged. She nodded once, crisp as autumn air. "Then cooking and cleaning you shall have. Where might I store my belongings?" He'd built a small room off the main cabin, intending it for storage. Now, watching her direct the wagon driver to unload a trunk and several carefully wrapped bundles, Cormac wondered what madness had possessed him to invite another soul into his carefully guarded existence. The driver accepted his payment and rattled back down the mountain, leaving them in sudden profound silence. Isadora stood with her hands resting on her belly, studying the massive peaks that surrounded them like protective walls. "It's beautiful here," she said simply. "Lonely, but beautiful." Something in her tone made Cormac look at her sharply. She wasn't making conversation, she was understanding something, recognizing the loneliness he'd wrapped around himself like armor for the past 5 years. "Lonely's the point," he muttered, turning toward the cabin. "Supper at 6. I eat plain food." "Of course you do." There was no mockery in her voice, just quiet acceptance that somehow irritated him more than mockery would have done as evening approached. The scent of something extraordinary drifted from his kitchen herbs he didn't recognize, bread that smelled like it belonged in a fine house rather than a mountain cabin. When he entered, Isadora had transformed his rough space into something almost civilized, with wildflowers in a jar and his scarred table set with careful attention. She served him venison stew rich with flavors he couldn't name, biscuits light as clouds and wild berry preserves that tasted like captured summer. He ate in silence, aware of her watching him with those knowing amber eyes. "Thank you," he said finally, the words rusty from disuse. "You're welcome, Mr. Holloway." She began clearing dishes, moving carefully but efficiently despite her condition. "I'll have breakfast ready at dawn." Only after she disappeared into her small room did Cormac realize he'd forgotten to ask what had driven a woman like her to answer such a desperate advertisement. The next morning brought the first snow, fat flakes drifting past the kitchen window where Isadora stood kneading bread dough with practiced rhythm. Cormac paused in the doorway, struck by the domesticity of the scene, something he deliberately avoided for years. "Storm's coming," he announced, pulling on his heavy coat. "I'll be checking the trap lines. Might not be back till after dark." She didn't look up from her work. "I'll keep supper warm." He'd expected questions, complaints about being left alone so soon after arriving. Instead, she simply nodded, already at home in his domain in a way that unsettled him. Cormac fled to the familiar solitude of the mountain trails, where only wind and wilderness could judge him. But even among the pines and granite peaks, he found his thoughts drifting back to the woman in his kitchen. The way she'd arranged his few belongings with subtle care, making space for herself without disturbing his careful order. The quiet grace with which she'd accepted his gruff manner and stark living conditions. Most puzzling was her obvious breeding. The hands that kneaded bread were soft despite their competence, her speech cultured despite their isolation. What catastrophe had reduced a gentlewoman to answering advertisements for mountain cooking positions? The trap lines yielded 2 rabbits and a troubling Discovery Fresh bear sign near the creek. Cormac reset his traps with extra caution, aware that with winter approaching, the bears would be desperate for final feeding before hibernation. A pregnant woman alone in the cabin suddenly seemed less like an inconvenience and more like a terrible responsibility. He returned as darkness fell, guided by lamplight glowing warm and golden in his windows. The sight stopped him cold. For 5 years, he'd returned to a dark, empty cabin that reflected the hollowness in his chest. Now, someone waited for his return. Inside, Isadora had been busy. His few books were arranged on a makeshift shelf, their worn spines catching the firelight. A quilt, one of her own, he realized covered his battered chair. The cabin felt transformed, not invaded, but completed somehow. "How was your day?" she asked, as if they were an old married couple instead of strangers bound by commerce. Cormac hung his coat and hat, struggling for words that had been unnecessary for so long. "Bear tracks by the creek. You'll need to stay close to the cabin." "Of course." She served him rabbit stew fragrant with wild herbs, fresh bread still warm from the oven. "I found a wonderful patch of late berries today. The preserves should keep well through winter. You shouldn't be wandering alone." The sharpness in his voice surprised them both. Isadora's amber eyes studied him over her own bowl. "I was quite careful, Mr. Holloway. I'm not foolish, despite present circumstances suggesting otherwise." There it was, the first crack in her composed facade, a hint of the pain that had driven her to his mountain. Cormac felt an unexpected urge to ask, to offer comfort, but comfort required emotional territory he declared off-limits years ago. "Just stay close," he repeated gruffly. After supper, she settled into his chair with mending while he worked at his small desk, updating his account books. The domestic scene felt surreal, a pregnant woman darning socks while her mountain hermit employer scratched numbers by lamplight. What would the people of Willow Creek think if they could see him now? "May I ask you something?" Isadora's voice was carefully neutral. Cormac's pen stilled. "Depends on the question. Why did you choose to live up here, alone?" The simple question hit like a physical blow. Memories rose unbidden, a different woman, a different life, a family that existed now only in nightmares and guilt-soaked dreams. "Personal business," he said finally. "Of course." She returned to her mending without offense, but something in her tone suggested she understood the weight of personal business that drove people to desperate measures. Outside, wind howled through the pines and snow tapped against the windows. Inside, lamplight created a circle of warmth around 2 damaged souls who had, through circumstance and necessity, found temporary shelter in each other's company. Neither spoke of it, but both felt it, the first tentative recognition that perhaps loneliness, no matter how carefully cultivated, was not the only way to survive life's cruelties. 3 weeks into their arrangement, disaster struck on a morning when November wind howled like grieving spirits through the pines. Cormac was splitting firewood when Isadora's cry of pain cut through the storm's roar, sharp and terrified. He found her doubled over in the kitchen, one hand gripping the table, the other pressed to her swollen belly. Her face had gone chalk white, amber eyes wide with fear. "Something's wrong," she gasped. "It's too early, but—" Another wave of pain bent her nearly double. Cormac's world tilted. He knew nothing about birthing, less about medical emergencies. The nearest doctor was in Willow Creek, 20 miles down a mountain trail that would be treacherous in this weather. But looking at Isadora's face, he knew they had no choice. "Can you ride?" he asked, already moving toward their coats. I think so. If you help me." He saddled his strongest horse, a steady Mare named Duchess, then lifted Isadora with surprising gentleness for such large hands. She bit back another cry as he settled her in the saddle, then swung up behind her, wrapping his arms around her protectively. The ride down the mountain was a nightmare of wind and early snow, treacherous rocks hidden under accumulating drifts. Isadora leaned back against his chest, her breathing sharp and irregular, while Cormac guided Duchess with careful precision along paths that could kill them all with one misstep. "Tell me something," she whispered during a brief lull in her pain. "Anything. I need ... distraction." Cormac's mind went blank. He'd shared nothing personal in 5 years, but her needs stripped away his carefully maintained barriers. "I used to be married," he said finally. "Had a little girl, Martha and Lucy." "What happened to them?" Her voice was barely audible over the wind. The words came out raw, unvarnished by time or self-forgiveness. "Cholera epidemic, summer of '71. I was up here hunting, providing for them, planning to build them a finer house. Came home to find them both buried in the Willow Creek Cemetery." Isadora's hand found his where it rested on the reins. "I'm sorry. Should have been there. Should have been taking care of them instead of chasing dreams in these mountains. And my husband," she said quietly, "should have been honest about his gambling debts instead of leaving me to face his creditors alone. But the dead make their own choices, Cormac. The living can only choose what comes next." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and somehow that intimacy, born of shared pain and mutual dependence, changed something fundamental between them. They reached Willow Creek as afternoon light faded behind storm clouds. Doc Hensley, a gruff man who delivered half the babies in the territory, took one look at Isadora and shooed Cormac into his waiting room like an anxious father. Hours passed. Cormac wore a path in the doctor's thin carpet, listening to sounds from the other room that made his hands shake. When Isadora cried out, he gripped his hat brim so hard the fabric tore. Finally, as full dark settled over the town, Doc Hensley emerged looking tired but satisfied. "False labor," he announced, "brought on by stress and overwork. The baby's fine, but she needs complete rest for at least a week. No travel, no exertion. But the cabin can wait. Mrs. Whitmore needs care, not isolation." The doctor's eyes narrowed. "You bring that woman back up your mountain too soon, and you'll lose them both." Cormac found lodging at the town's small inn, 2 rooms that cost him a month's worth of careful savings. But watching Isadora sleep peacefully in a real bed, her face finally relaxed from pain, he knew he'd have paid 10 times the amount. Next morning, she woke to find him dozing in a chair beside her bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes, his hair disheveled from running worried hands through it. "You stayed," she said softly. "Doc said someone should watch over you." But they both knew it was more than medical necessity that had kept him by her side through the long night. Something had shifted during their desperate ride down the mountain, in the sharing of grief that had remained unspoken for too long. "Thank you," Isadora whispered, "for everything." Cormac nodded, not trusting his voice. Outside their window, Willow Creek was waking to another day, but inside their small room, 2 lonely souls had discovered that sometimes salvation came not through solitude, but through the terrifying grace of letting someone else matter, recovery. In Willow Creek brought unexpected revelations. During their enforced stay at the inn, Isadora gradually shared fragments of her story of Philadelphia marriage to a charming man who gambled away her inheritance and left her facing creditors, who cared nothing for pregnant widows. Her desperate journey west had been funded by selling her mother's jewelry, each piece a sacrifice that brought her closer to survival and farther from the genteel life she'd known. Cormac found himself sharing too, words coming easier in the lamplit evenings when pain medication made Isadora drowsy and defenses dropped. He spoke of Martha, who'd laughed at his jokes and made their small house feel like a palace. Of Lucy, barely walking when the fever took her, her small hand curled around his finger as she fought for breath he couldn't give her. Guilt is a heavy burden, Isadora observed one evening, her hand resting on her belly where the baby moved restlessly, but it makes poor company for the living. You speaking from experience? I blame myself for not seeing my husband's death sooner, for not being stronger, cleverer, more capable of preventing our ruin. She shifted carefully on the narrow bed. But guilt doesn't pay creditors or feed unborn children. Action does. On their fourth day in town, Cormac was arranging their accounts at the general store when Mrs. Calloway, the preacher's wife, approached with pursed lips and obvious disapproval. Mr. Holloway, I must speak plainly. People are talking about your arrangement with that woman. Cormac's jaw tightened. What arrangement would that be, ma'am? A pregnant woman, unmarried by all appearances, living alone with you on that mountain. It's unseemly. Heat rose in Cormac's chest, protective fury he hadn't felt since Martha's death. Mrs. Whitmore is my employee, nothing more. She's a respectable widow seeking honest work. Respectable widows don't answer advertisements for mountain housekeeping positions. Mrs. Calloway's voice carried the judgment of those who'd never faced true desperation. Mark my words, Mr. Holloway, no good can come of such arrangements. That evening, Cormac found Isadora sitting by the window, watching snow fall on the town's main street. Something in her posture suggested she'd overheard his encounter with Mrs. Calloway. Perhaps, she said without turning, it would be better if I sought other employment in a town where my presence wouldn't compromise your reputation. My reputation? The laugh that escaped him was harsh. I'm a hermit who talks to trees and hasn't had a conversation longer than good day in 5 years. My reputation's already settled. She turned then, amber eyes serious. You've been kinder to me than I had any right to expect. I won't repay that kindness by making you the subject of gossip. Cormac moved to the window, standing close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender soap she'd bought with her careful savings. You think I care what these people say about me? I think you care more than you admit. And I think you deserve better than the scandal my presence might create. He studied her profile. The determined set of her jaw that he was learning meant she'd made up her mind about something. What if I told you I don't want other employment for you? What if I told you that coming home to a lit window and warm supper has become ... necessary? I'd say that necessity born of loneliness makes poor foundation for permanent arrangements. And what if it's not just loneliness? The words escaped before he could stop them, hanging in the air between them like a challenge. Isadora's breath caught. Cormac ... I know it's complicated. I know you're carrying another man's child, and I'm not offering. That is, I wouldn't presume. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated by his inability to voice what was growing between them. I just know that these past weeks, having you there, it's made that cabin feel like a home instead of just a place to survive. She was quiet for a long moment, her hand moving in slow circles over her belly. Finally, she spoke so softly he had to lean closer to hear. I feel it too. This ... connection between us. But I won't be another burden in your life, another responsibility. That might break your heart. What if you're not a burden? What if you're the reason I'm finally ready to live again instead of just existing? Outside, snow continued falling, blanketing the town in pristine white that covered all manner of imperfections. Inside their small room, two people who thought themselves beyond such possibilities began to acknowledge that sometimes love arrived not with trumpets and fanfare, but quietly, steadily, like snow accumulating one flake at a time until the world was transformed. The return to the mountain cabin came with December's first hard freeze, when ice formed thick enough on the creek to support a man's weight. Doc Hensley had declared Isadora fit to travel, though with strict instructions about rest and proper nutrition. The baby had settled into a steady rhythm of growth, making her belly round and prominent beneath her carefully altered dresses, but something fundamental had changed. Between them during their time in Willow Creek, conversations flowed easier. Now touches lingered longer, and the careful distance they'd maintained was gradually giving way to something warmer and more dangerous. Cormac found himself watching Isadora as she worked, noting how she hummed softly while kneading bread, or how afternoon light caught copper threads in her hair. She'd begun wearing it in a softer style, less severely pinned, and the change made her look younger, more approachable. For her part, Isadora had started noticing things about Cormac that had nothing to do with their employer-employee arrangement. The way he was unfailingly gentle with animals, speaking softly to his horses and handling even his hunting dogs with patient care. How he'd carved small wooden toys, a horse, a doll, a spinning top, and left them on her windowsill without explanation, clearly intended for the baby she carried. The evening that changed everything arrived with a blizzard that howled down from the peaks like a living thing, rattling windows and piling snow against the cabin doors. They were trapped together in the warm circle of firelight, the outside world reduced to wind and white chaos. Isadora had been mending one of his shirts, her needle moving in steady rhythm, when she suddenly gasped and dropped her work. Her hands flew to her belly, eyes wide with wonder. "What is it?" Cormac was across the room instantly, concern written across his weathered features. "The baby," she whispered, voice filled with amazement. "It's here. Give me your hand." Before he could object, she'd pressed his palm against her rounded belly. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a definite push, a small foot or elbow making itself known from within. Cormac went very still, his large hand spanning her belly, feeling life move beneath his calloused palm. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, something irreversible passed between them. "Strong," he said softly. "Going to be a fighter, like its mother." Isadora's smile was tremulous, vulnerable. Or its father. The word hung in the air, weighted, with possibility and fear. They both knew she wasn't referring to her dead husband. Isadora. Her name on his lips was a prayer, a question, a declaration all at once. "I know it's impossible," she whispered. "I know the situation is complicated, but these past months, the way you've cared for me, for us, I've begun to hope for things. I thought we're lost forever." Cormac's free hand came up to cup her face, thumb tracing the delicate line of her cheekbone. "I never thought I'd want a family again. Never thought I'd be brave enough to risk that kind of loss. And now? Now I think I've been a coward. Hiding up here, calling it grief when it was really fear," his voice roughened. "But watching you, seeing your courage in the face of everything you've lost, it's made me want to be brave too." The baby kicked again, as if approving of their conversation. Isadora laughed softly, the sound bright as silver bells in the storm-wrapped cabin. "What are we doing, Cormac?" "I think," he said carefully, "we're falling in love." "And what do we do about that?" "I think," he continued, leaning closer until his forehead rested against hers, "we stop pretending it's not happening. The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered with careful honesty. When they broke apart, Isadora's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I can't promise it will be easy," she whispered. "A ready-made family, a baby." "That's not yours, will be mine," Cormac interrupted firmly. "If you'll have me, if you'll both have me. Biology doesn't make a father, Isadora. Love does. Commitment does. Being there when it matters does." Outside, the blizzard raged with renewed fury, but inside their cabin, two hearts that had been broken and battered by life's cruelties began to heal in the warmth of newfound love. They sat together on his old chair, her head on his shoulder, his hand still resting on her belly where their child, and it was theirs now, completely and irrevocably continued its restless dance. "I love you," Isadora said simply. "I love you too," Cormac replied. "Both of you." And for the first time in 5 years, the mountain no longer felt like a place of exile. It felt like home. Spring arrived late that year, with April snow still dusting the high peaks when Isadora's labor began in earnest. Unlike the false alarm months earlier, this time there was no mistaking the real thing. Cormac had prepared as best he could, reading every medical book he could acquire from Willow Creek, consulting with Doc Hensley about what to expect. Nothing had prepared him for the reality of watching the woman he loved struggle through the demanding work of bringing new life into the world. "You're doing wonderfully," he murmured, smoothing damp hair back from her forehead. "So strong, so brave." "Easy for you to say," Isadora managed between contractions, but her attempt at humor was strained. "You're not." "Oh God, here comes another one." They'd converted the small back room into a birthing chamber, with clean linens, hot water, and everything Doc Hensley had recommended. But as dawn broke over the mountains and labor continued, Cormac began to worry that his preparations wouldn't be enough. "Something's not right," Isadora gasped during a brief respite. "It's taking too long, isn't it?" Cormac's own fear sharpened, but he kept his voice steady. "First babies often take their time. Doc said so himself." What the doctor had actually said was more complicated, that if labor went on too long, if there were complications, Cormac should be prepared to make impossible choices. The nearest help was still 20 miles away, and in a crisis, 20 miles might as well be 1,000. As afternoon wore toward evening, Isadora's strength began to flag. Her face was pale with exhaustion, and the spaces between contractions grew longer, weaker. Cormac could see her fighting to stay focused, to keep pushing when her body wanted to surrender. "Listen to me," he said, kneeling beside the bed and taking her hand in both of his. "You remember what you told me about guilt making poor company?" "For the living?" She nodded weakly. "Well, fear makes even worse company, and I'm scared, Isadora. Terrified that I might lose you both. But fear isn't going to help us now. What will? Love, trust, the same courage that brought you up this mountain. In the first place," he squeezed her hand, "you're the strongest person I know. If anyone can do this, it's you." As if summoned by his words, another contraction began, stronger than any before. Isadora bore down with renewed determination, and suddenly Cormac could see the crown of a small head. "There," he breathed. "I can see the baby." What followed was a blur of urgent activity guiding tiny shoulders, supporting the emerging form, clearing airways, and then suddenly, miraculously, holding a slippery, wailing infant against his chest. "A daughter," he said, voice thick with emotion. "A beautiful, perfect daughter." Isadora was crying, laughing, reaching for the baby with trembling hands. Cormac placed the infant on her chest, watching in wonder as mother and child met for the first time. "Hello, little one," Isadora whispered. "Hello, my darling girl." The baby had copper hair like her mother and strong lungs that announced her displeasure with the cold mountain air. But as Isadora spoke, she quieted, tiny fingers grasping blindly until they found and gripped her mother's finger. "She's perfect," Cormac said softly. "Absolutely perfect. She is, isn't she?" Isadora looked up at him, eyes bright with tears and joy. "What should we call her?" They discussed names during the long winter evenings, but somehow none of their careful choices seemed right now. Looking at this small person who'd fought her way into the world with such determination, only one name felt appropriate. "Grace." Cormac said, "Her name should be Grace. Grace Holloway? If you'll marry me." The proposal came out without preamble, born of the overwhelming emotion of the moment. "I know this isn't how these things are usually done, but yes." Isadora's answer was immediate, certain. "Yes, of course, yes." 3 days later, when Isadora was strong enough to travel, they made their way down to Willow Creek. Reverend Calloway performed the ceremony in his small church, with Doc Hensley and his wife as witnesses. The same townspeople who'd whispered about their arrangement now smiled at the obvious love between the couple and cooed over the baby who'd already wrapped her tiny fingers around her father's heart. Grace Holloway slept peacefully through her parents' wedding vows, safe in her mother's arms, unaware that she was witnessing the transformation of three broken souls into something beautiful and whole. As they exchanged rings, simple gold bands that had cost Cormac most of his savings, he looked into his wife's amber eyes and saw his future stretching ahead, bright with possibilities he'd thought were lost forever. "I love you, Mrs. Holloway," he murmured against her lips. "I love you too, Mr. Holloway," she whispered back. "All of us do." 5 years later, Grace Holloway was the undisputed queen of her mountain domain, a copper-haired whirlwind who could track deer with her father and bake biscuits with her mother, who spoke to the horses in the same gentle tones Cormac had taught her and arranged wildflowers with her mother's artistic eye. The cabin had grown too, with additional rooms to accommodate their expanding family. 2-year-old James, dark-haired like his father, but with his mother's amber eyes, toddled after his sister with determined steps, chattering in the half-language of small children. And Isadora, rounding again with a third child, moved through their home with the serene contentment of a woman who'd found her place in the world. "Papa, look what I caught." Grace burst through the kitchen door, proudly holding up a string of trout from the creek. At 5, she was already showing promise as a fisher, though her technique involved more enthusiasm than skill. "Well done, little mountain girl," Cormac grinned, lifting her high enough to see over his shoulder. "Your mama's going to make a fine supper from these. I helped too," James announced from the doorway, though his help had mainly consisted of throwing pebbles in the water and scaring away half the fish in the creek. "You certainly did," Isadora agreed, settling heavily into her chair. At 7 months pregnant, she tired more easily than she had with Grace, but her face glowed with contentment. "Both my brave fishers deserve a reward." The reward turned out to be fresh berry pie, made from the wild strawberries Grace had discovered in a hidden meadow. As they sat around the table that had once served only Cormac's solitary meals, he marveled at the transformation of his life. "Papa," Grace said suddenly, fixing him with the serious expression she wore when asking important questions. "Mama told me I had a different papa before you. Is that right?" Cormac's fork paused halfway to his mouth. They'd always planned to tell the children the truth when they were old enough to understand, but he hadn't expected the conversation quite so soon. "That's right," he said carefully. "Your mama was married to another man before she married me. But you're my real papa, aren't you?" Grace's voice held just a hint of uncertainty. "The papa who teaches me things and reads me stories and fixes my toys when they break?" "I'm your papa in every way that matters," Cormac assured her. "Being a papa isn't about where someone comes from. It's about love and care and being there when you need help." like how you taught me to fish and how to whistle and how to tell which berries are good to eat. Exactly like that. Grace nodded solemnly, the matter settled in her child's mind. Then you're the best papa ever. Later that evening, after the children were tucked into their beds with stories of brave mountain princesses and talking bears, Cormac and Isadora sat on their porch, watching stars emerge above the peaks. The night was warm for late spring, with the scent of pine and wildflowers drifting on the gentle breeze. "Do you ever regret it?" Isadora asked softly. "The quiet life you gave up for all this chaos?" Cormac considered the question, thinking of his younger self, angry, grieving, convinced that solitude was the only safe path through life's uncertainties. "I regret the time I wasted," he said finally. "The years I spent hiding up here, thinking that avoiding love would protect me from loss. And now? Now I know that love isn't something to survive. It's something to embrace, even knowing it might hurt." He took her hand, intertwining their fingers. "You taught me that, you and Grace. You taught me grace." Isadora smiled, the expression he'd fallen in love with years ago when she'd first stepped down from that wagon, pregnant and desperate but unbroken. "We taught each other. You showed me that strength isn't about facing the world alone. It's about choosing who to face it with." From inside the cabin came the soft sound of Grace talking to her little brother, probably telling him one of the elaborate stories she invented about the forest animals. Their voices were sleepy, content, the sound of children who'd never known what it meant to feel unwanted or unsafe. "3 children," Cormac mused, his hand moving to rest on Isadora's rounded belly. "When I answered that advertisement, I thought I was hiring a cook. And instead you got a ready-made family and all the complications that come with it." "Instead," he corrected, "I got everything I didn't know I was missing." A meteor streaked across the sky above them, bright and brief and beautiful. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called to its mate, the sound echoing off the mountain walls that had once felt like prison walls but now felt like the safest embrace in the world. Inside those walls lived a family born not of blood or convenience, but of choice, the daily choice to love, to forgive, to believe in second chances and the grace that comes when broken people decide to heal together. The mountain man, who'd thought he was buying a cook, had instead found redemption in the arms of a woman who taught him that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in solitude, but in the courage to let others close enough to matter. And in learning that lesson, he discovered that home was never a place. It was the people who chose to stay when staying was hard, who loved when love required sacrifice, who built something beautiful from the ashes of everything they'd lost. As Grace would say years later, when telling the story to children of her own, Papa learned that the best treasures are the ones you never knew you were looking for. And Mama learned that sometimes the safest harbor is found in the most unexpected storms, and they all lived, not just happily ever after, but gratefully ever after, which, as anyone who's known real loss will tell you, is the most precious ending of all.